on and going to give people a couple of moments to join before we get started.
Thanks, Edith. Well, welcome. We've got Aaron, Angela, Elaine, Corey, Q. Oh, I already saw you. Who you? Never mind. For WebEx folks, is there an easy way for me to view more people? Anybody a WebEx guru?
You can
In the list, Ben, or humans, actual faces?
Humans. Yeah, human faces. Maybe side by side. Will that give me more people? Let's see.
If you're doing like the stack layout where it's got people on top and the shared content on the bottom, there's like a couple lines between the people and the content. And if you pull on those and like keep pulling, you can get up to, I think, like 12 people at the same
Yeah,
time.
I can get 12, but I can't get more than that. Okay.
Do you have one or two screens, Ben?
I have one giant screen and one smaller screen.
Okay, I was going to ask whether, I don't know if you can pop out.
I don't think so. It's okay. Usually there's a way to see how many people you can see at a time, but that's all right. Well, for folks that joined, welcome. Sorry you're listening to me trying to figure out how I could see more of your wonderful faces and names all at the same time as we do this. Looks like we have a pretty good group. Should we get started? Sure. Well, welcome. As a reminder, Ben Duncan, he, him pronouns with Kearns and West will be facilitating today. It's great to be in space with folks with the Oregon Department of Energy Strategy Advisory Group meeting number 5, November 20th, 2024. So hopefully y'all are in the right place. So just really excited to get into the conversation today. A little bit of housekeeping. As a reminder, if we go to the next slide, just some of the WebEx functions, as you've already heard me trying to explore for myself. You can change, there's a couple lines if you look next to the boxes, depending how you're configured. There's kind of 3 straight lines you can either drag down or drag across to help adjust either the screen size or how many people you're seeing. Up on the top of your screen, you should see either a plus and minus with a percentage that can also open up slides or decrease slides to the point it's helpful. Importantly, as we go through the conversation today, if you on the bottom of your screen, you'll see the mute button. I encourage folks to stay on mute if you're not speaking. Feel free, of course, and it's very helpful if you come off mute when you do want to talk. You'll also see the raise hand button on the bottom of your screen as well. We do have chat enabled. Make sure your setting is to everyone to ensure that folks are able to see that. I will just ask that we don't use chat for virtual side conversations, so just be mindful of how much we're using that function. You can use reactions, but primarily we'll be using reactions if you want to agree with someone, but mostly for the raise hand button. As we go through the conversation today, if you have any challenges, feel free to reach out to our team and we'll help you navigate some of the technology. And with that, I'm going to ask Edith to help set a tone and a vision for what we're hoping to achieve today.
Thanks, Ben. And hi, everybody. As you know, I'm Edith Bayer, and I'm with the Oregon Department of Energy. And I just want to kind of set us here in our meeting objectives before we get started. So you've all seen the agenda. We sent it around last week. We're going to start by presenting some framing that we've developed for an energy wallet, air quality modeling, and geospatial mapping for some complementary analytical tools to help us work with the results of the modeling. And if you hear my daughter in the background, apologies. And we will be looking for your kind of quick feedback, but also I want to make the point that we have an online portal, and we have a public consultation period open for that now, and we really encourage you to send in written comments as well. We also will provide an updated timeline for our activities in 2025. We've been doing a lot of work to set ourselves up for phase 2 engagement, which is the focus on policy discussions for the energy strategy. And we really want to consult with you on how we're framing that up. So not just present our thinking so far, but also get your feedback and your thoughts and your perspectives on how that looks and how we might improve on it. Ben, back to you.
Great, thanks, Edith. So if we go to the next slide, and how we'll achieve those objectives through our agenda. We'll move through. I got a couple more slides to set a stage for today, including our group agreements. We'll approve our meeting summary from the last meeting. We'll introduce ourselves to each other, and then we will move into a series of conversations. And so we have our team from SETI who will join to discuss the energy wallet, air quality modeling, and geospatial mapping. We have some key questions and reflections that we've put out to you already. And so we'll revisit that and ask for folks really to take this information and to provide some additional consult to Oregon Department of Energy. We'll get an updated timeline and really just help this group kind of see where this process is going and unfolding. As we kind of cross into and go into 2025, we'll build some room for a break, stretch our legs a little bit, and then we'll be asking for some feedback as we think about phase 2 engagement. So this is kind of this transitionary space to move into phase 2, some structures and setup, some framing that I think Oregon Department of Energy would really love to get your feedback and wisdom on. We'll close with some next steps, kind of outline where we're going from here even further, and get you out of here by noon. Let's keep going. Go next slide. And we've walked through these a number of times. I guess I'll continue to encourage and reiterate that these group agreements are meant to support a space where we're able to kind of bring our differing perspectives. We are here. You are here as a group to offer insights. You may not always agree. And in order to be productive and constructive as we have these conversations, we offer these for curating a space where that type of deliberation is most effective. So certainly we've been really intentional about the agendas that we create. So really honoring the topics and sticking with what we put forward, really listening to each other, often asking kind of why a different perspective might exist, and not just listening to respond, but listening to understand, to be respectful and candid, to keep an open mind, asking questions, again, understanding why, particularly where there's difference of thought, opinion, or vision. I'll ask all of us, right, each and every one of us, be accountable to ourselves and to each other, to create this space, respect for each other, resolving differences to the extent that this group, you'll hear me say this every time, to the extent that this group can find common ground and speak as one collective voice. That's incredibly helpful for the agency and for our collective work as we develop the strategy. And then, we will use a variety of tactics today. We're not doing any kind of roundtable. So I'll just ask folks to be mindful. There are spaces for conversation, step up, step back, but really recognize and share space with each other. And to my comment earlier, for chat conversations, just, it can be really distracting for virtual side talk. So anyways, y'all have been great. We've had some wonderful conversations, but again, this is not just kind of something we throw on a slide, but really meant to support our ability to have really productive conversations. So let's go to the next slide. We'll do some introductions. I'm just going to run along the list. It's going to be a mixture of staff, members, and consultant team, but I'll go in order of the alphabet on my screen. So Alan. So I'll just name an affiliation for today. No Halloween candy or anything fun for our opening question. Alan? Zelenka? I see your name there, Alan. I'll come back to you with Oregon Department of Energy. Angela,
Hi, Angela Long with Rockcrest Consulting.
great, welcome. Ann Thrall Nash,
Good morning, everyone. I am the USDOE fellow with Odo this year.
thank you, Ann. Brian,
Yes, Brian Adams, President of Co-Energy Propane, also board member representation for the Pacific Propane Gas Association.
thanks, Brian. Charity,
Charity Fain, I'm the Executive Director at Community Energy Project.
thank you. Chris Golightly, I know you're out there somewhere. Pritvic, okay, Chris Golightly, Columbia River Intertribal Fishing Commission, I know you're out there. Corey Scott,
Good morning, Corey Scott, Pacific Power.
thank you. Edith, you've said hello. We'll continue to know who you are. Elaine Prouse,
Hi, good morning, everyone. Elaine Proust, Energy Trust of Oregon.
and then just Elaine, just can you confirm that you'll be the ongoing rep for Energy Trust going forward?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, thank
Great.
you.
Thank you. Emily Griffith,
Good morning, Emily Griffith with Renewable Northwest. Thanks.
thank you. Hugh,
Hugh Arsenault, Odo Policy Analyst.
thank you. Ivy,
Good morning, everybody. Ivy Quach here with QB Fabrication and Welding.
welcome Ivy. Jeff,
Jeff Hammerland, Portland State University, retired professor.
thank you. Jennifer Hillhart, I know you're out there, Jennifer Hillhart. God, you're on mute if you're saying hello. Jennifer Jolly,
Good morning. I'm sitting in for Scott Sims of the Public Power Council. My name is Jennifer Jolly. I'm with the Oregon Municipal Electric Utilities Association.
great, thank you. And so Jennifer Hillhart, I see your message. Team, if you can help Jennifer Hillhart figure out if she can unmute. Jeremy, I know we'll hear from you later, but hello.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Jeremy Hargreaves. I'm a principal at Evolved Energy Research, and I'm leading up the energy modeling with the CTI team.
Thank you. Jessica,
Hi, I'm Jessica Rikers. I'm the Technology and Policy Manager at Odo, and I'll be monitoring the chat throughout the meeting.
thank you, Jessica. Joni,
Good morning, everybody. This is Joni Sliger, Clean Electricity and Markets Analyst here at Odo.
thank you. Josh Price,
Josh Price, Project Manager here at Odo.
and then Joshua.
Good morning, Joshua Bassifin with Climate Solutions.
Thank you. Laura Tabor,
Good morning, Laura Tabor, Climate Action Director with the Nature Conservancy.
thank you. Lauren Poor,
Hi, Lauren Poor. I'm with PGE and I'm sitting in for Jimmy Lindsay today.
thank you. Lauren Rosenstein,
I'm Lauren Rosenstein. I'm the Community Equity and Inclusion Analyst at the Oregon Department of Energy.
thank you. Maria Verano,
Good morning, everyone. Maria Verano with Kearns and West.
thank you. Michael Friels,
Good morning, Michael Friels, Oregon Department of Energy. Thank you.
thank you. Patrick Mills, Patrick, we got you. I see your name, so I know you're here. Rakesh,
Morning, everyone. My name is Rakesh Aneja, and I lead electric mobility for Daimler Truck in North America.
okay, thank you. Rebecca Smith, okay. Rebecca, we can't hear you if you're talking. Ruby,
Hi, everyone. Ruby Moore Bloom. I'm a research analyst at the Clean Energy Transition Institute on the consultant team working with Odo.
okay, thank you. Ruchi,
Good morning, Ruchi Sudhir. I'm Associate Director for Strategic Engagement at Oregon Department of Energy. Nice to see you all.
thank you. Shannon,
Hello, Shannon Souza, Oregon Solar and Storage Industry Association and Oregon Coast Energy Alliance Network.
okay, thank you. And Rebecca, we see your intro in the chat, Renewable Hydrogen Alliance, thank you. Tim McMahon.
Yeah, good morning. Tim McMahon here, siting and permitting attorney with Stallreeves Law Firm.
Thanks, Tim. And last but not least, Tucker.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. Tucker Billman, the Director of Government Relations for the Oregon Rural Electric Cooperative Association.
Great, thank you all. Did I miss anybody or anybody that joined late?
Yeah, Alan Zelenka, Assistant Director, Oregon Department of Energy.
Great, thank you. And Andrea Cowdell, I see you're Climate and Energy Trust Consultant with the Port. I am not an expert at figuring out how to get folks unmuted, so let's keep working on that, but please feel free to use the chat if you'd like to provide some input, and we'll keep working on the tech. And Alma, welcome, Northwest Energy Coalition on behalf of Fred Hewitt. Thank you. Okay, let's keep going. So as we've committed to each and every meeting, you'll know we will post meeting summaries for the public online after the advisory group has approved the previous month's meeting or the previous meeting if that's not the previous month. So I'm gonna just ask that folks, if there's any edits or changes, questions or additions, to please raise your hand. Looks like it's my hand raised. Not seeing any. Just ask for, God, it's hard in a room like this. If folks can either raise their hand or give a thumbs up or some mechanism to let me know that you're good to approve the meeting summary. Okay, thank you. This will be a practice of raising your hand and taking it down for folks that are able to. Thumbs up. Thank you, Emily. The reaction of the thumb is perfect. Hands, hands, hands. Okay. Thank you. We'll figure out a process for this that works, but largely we just want to do our due diligence to make sure that if there's any edits, changes, and making sure that you felt like your voices are represented in the summary that we're providing. That's what's most important. And I know you all expressed interest in making sure that we were capturing both agreement and spaces of disagreement. Okay, well, let's consider the approval of the last meeting summary as good. So with that.
I think I see Rakesh's hand up. Is that right?
Sorry, it took me a while to raise my hand. If this was the in-person meeting, I was very much present and I noticed my name is absent. So just wanted to point that out, please.
Oh, you were very much present. Thank you for that. And thanks, Edith, for catching. I'm having people raise their hand to approve and raise their hand to provide input. So with that addition, Rakesh, thank you. We'll make sure if anybody else, again, just maybe throw it in the chat if you see anybody who was there but didn't see it. Tucker?
Yeah, sorry, that was an accident. I'll take it down.
Oh, okay. No problem. We will call on accidental hands as well as purposeful hands. Thank you. Okay, well, with that, let's move to the next slide. And I'm going to pass it off to my colleagues.
All right, thank you, Ben. So again, my name is Renore Bloom. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm part of the consultant team helping here with the energy strategy. My colleague Jeremy and I will be presenting to you today about some of these complementary environmental justice and equity related analyses that our team is doing to supplement the energy modeling. Next slide. And then next. So this is, I'm going to take you through just kind of a visual representation of the different pieces of this analysis, and then we'll go into more detail on each one. Starting with the energy modeling, this is what we've been talking about for the past several months. This has been the focus, and getting feedback on the reference scenario, then getting feedback on the what if questions to model as scenarios. And once this energy modeling is complete, it will produce results. And then these results are starting to feed into some subsequent analyses. The first one of these is the energy wallet. So this examines energy spending and energy burden for different customer types, as well as how the timing of investing in electrification could impact customer costs. So some of the feedback we're looking for here is how to define these different customer groups. And Jeremy will talk more about this in a little bit. The next one is air quality modeling. So again, this comes from the energy modeling results and puts them through a different model that looks at the impact of reduced particulate matter on health outcomes and associated economic benefit. And the feedback we're looking for here is about the geographic regions that we're using to model these impacts. And then there's a third piece, which is geospatial mapping. And it's a little bit on its own kind of parallel track. It does not come directly from the energy modeling results, but it explores community level energy inequities and their relationship to socioeconomic disparities. And we're looking for feedback on what are the highest priority indicators to include in this mapping. And we're hoping that these resulting maps can be used to help interpret the results when we get to the policy conversations early next year, which is what you'll be talking about later in this meeting. I'm going to hand it over to Jeremy now to walk through the energy wallet and air quality in a little more detail.
Thanks, Ruby. So first, the energy wallet here, the idea is that we'd use this to look at how changes in the way customers use energy and changes in the way that energy is produced will impact what kind of costs they see. And with a lot of electrification, it's no secret that electricity bills would increase over time, but that's also paired with a decrease in the cost of other things like gasoline, like natural gas that we're spending less on. Next slide. So the questions that we're answering with this type of analysis, where the energy wallet is that wallet or like basket of energy costs across everything, the home heating, vehicle miles traveled, other types of energy use in buildings, we'd be looking at how is total energy spending for different customer types impacted. And this was a conversation that we've had in past meetings where we were thinking about what kind of customers would it be interesting to look at. And we're looking at up to 5 different so-called customer vignettes where we are taking customer energy use in their homes, customer energy use in their vehicles, and looking at how would their costs change. What is the impact on customers of investing in electrification earlier or later? So if you're purchasing an electric vehicle early, in the next 5 years versus the next 20 years, what does that mean for your energy costs? And then how is energy burden impacted? Next slide. What's shown here on the right-hand side is an example of this type of analysis, and it comes from work that we've done in Wisconsin. So what's shown here is the costs for an average customer in Wisconsin starting in 2022 when this analysis was done and going through to 2050. And in these scenarios, they were looking at going to net zero. So there was a lot of electrification happening. There was movement from fossil power to clean energy. And we can see that in those net zero cases, then expenses for electricity are going up. Those are the light blue colors there. But at the same time, we've got these big decreases in the amount of fossil liquids primarily, and also natural gas that was being purchased. And so that's decreasing. And overall, in the net zero scenarios, we see maybe a 15% decrease in their overall energy spending relative to where they start in 2023 and relative to the baseline case. The other type of analysis that we do here is changing when we're seeing customers invest in electrified technologies. So that bottom chart is an example of the year where customers are purchasing an electric vehicle. So are they purchasing it in 2022, or are they purchasing it in any year through to 2050? And how does that change their overall costs? And that's useful to look at because given different household incomes, then customers may be unable to purchase an electric vehicle in a particular year, may push their purchase back in time. and understanding how that might impact customer bottom line and energy burden is a useful output here. So we do this scaled for 5 different customer types, and the definition of those customer types is what we want to work on with this group. Next slide. So this is feedback requested, where you could come back to us with your options or what you see as the most important types of customers to look at here. The proposed set here to choose from, where we're choosing up to 5 of these 9 options, include a typical owner-occupied single-family detached home. That's that first one, homeowner, and the metrics here that's shown for each one of these is what is their primary heating type, what is their annual energy use for all fuels in kilobTUs, and then what is their vehicle miles traveled. And this varies depending on whether they are urban living, rural living, what part of the state they're in, what sort of income bracket they fall into. We have rural home, coastal home, high priority area homes, so those that are located within ODO's high priority area counties, extreme low income single family, so a single family with income less than 15,000 a year, weatherization, so a home that was built prior to 1990 and we assume hasn't been updated, it has poor insulation, and so it's driving more energy use per square foot. Manufactured homes, so typical manufactured home that has higher energy use per square foot as well. Average renter, and then low income renter multifamily buildings. So these are all of the options here that were developed with your input from last time, and we'd love your feedback to narrow these down to the 5 that we want to move forward with. Next slide. The analysis itself is going to look at annual energy cost. So the starting point there for these buildings is to use the RBSA from 2022 and then use a EIA energy cost per square foot. So that gives us that energy spending in the present day that we would then scale going forward. Vehicle miles traveled, so the H&T affordability index, it's possible that we update this with some DEQ vehicle miles traveled per county data. Vehicle mile travel cost, so using a US Bureau of Transportation per mile cost, and then energy burden, a percentage of gross income spent on energy. So those would be the output metrics that we could compare across our different customer vignettes. Next slide. Okay, so moving into air quality modeling, next slide here. The outputs from our models are all of the ways that customers are consuming energy and the way that that energy is produced. And associated with that consumption and production are emissions of different types of gases. And so we are outputting for each of the scenarios that we'll run emissions in terms of CO2, but from an air quality perspective, importantly, we're looking at NOx and SOx and methane, VOCs. All of these things are inputs into our air quality modeling. And the model that we use paired with our Energy Pathways and RIO models is the EPA Co-Benefits Risk Assessment Model, or COBRA. And what that's calculating is, first of all, changes in air quality, particulate matter, but also SO2, NOx. And then what does that do to health outcomes? And those are translated into economic benefits. There's a variety of different categories that the COBRA air quality modeling looks at from a health outcome perspective. It includes things like adult and infant mortality, heart attack rates, respiratory diseases, asthma, lung cancer, hospitalization, work and school, lost days. And all of these things have some translated economic outcome as well. And so we would look at how it changes going forward in time as we go to a cleaner and lower emissions economy. Go to the next slide. And this is an example of that from our recent work with CTI on the Net Zero Northwest study last year. What's shown here is for the 4 northwestern states, Idaho, Montana, Oregon, Washington, what are the avoided deaths per million people in 2030 and 2050? And COBRA produces a low and high estimate of those, and that's what's shown there. Oregon in the blue is showing for 2050 a low estimate of 16 deaths per million people and a high of 36 million. But this is just one of those metrics. It's avoided deaths, but we also have a whole set of different health outcomes that we would be looking at in this analysis. Next slide. So I will, well, one thing before I pass it off to Ruby here to cover this, I just wanted to mention a topic that came up in our previous conversations about the air quality modeling, which was wildfires and indoor air quality. Those two things are not considered in the COBRA modeling framework. They're both important drivers of air quality, but for our analysis, where we're really looking at what is the impact of a shift in the way that we're consuming and producing energy, we're looking at those changes in outdoor air quality pollutants and their resulting health outcomes. And so that's what we can cover quantitatively with this type of modeling. So I will pass it off to Ruby here to talk about our county clustering work.
Thanks, Jeremy. So as Jeremy talked about the air quality modeling and those impacts, this slide is showing the proposed regions that we would be using to present those impacts. So the energy modeling is looking at Oregon state as a whole, and then Oregon as 2 zones, just Eastern and Western. But some of the feedback we heard from our environmental justice and equity working group was about the importance of understanding a little bit more localized air quality impacts, more localized than just East and West. So we tried to develop a set of regions, a set of county clusters that would be useful. So to develop these, we started with some variables related to air quality. These included temperature, number of vehicles, levels of fine particulate matter, percentage of community members living at or below federal poverty level, and then % of adults with asthma. And so we weighted these variables and came up with a set of county clusters and then overlaid those with other regions in Oregon, including regional employment offices and transportation regions. And together, this kind of helped us develop the proposed regions shown on the screen here. So the feedback requested here is if these regions are going to be helpful for interpreting the results about health impacts that Jeremy described. And we can go to next slide. So lastly, our team is developing a geospatial mapping analysis with equity overlays that could be used to identify communities with environmental resiliency, community well-being, economic, and equity vulnerabilities. Next. The high-level approach is to use publicly available data sets to understand community-level energy inequities and their relationship to socioeconomic disparities. When available, these data sets are representing census tracts in Oregon in the 2018 to 2022 time range. And by using open source data and a replicable approach, we hope that these maps could be updated in the future with new data sets. And the idea is that the maps might be able to help identify communities with particular needs or vulnerabilities to inform the policy conversations early next year. We've created a few maps as a starting point, but the feedback that we're looking for is which indicators are highest priority to map, and then we'll develop a set of somewhere between 10 to 15 maps that will be most helpful. Next slide. So this is an example of one of the maps. These maps are bivariate maps, so they show the community level relationship between two indicators. And that's also open to feedback. If it's more helpful to just show one indicator per map, we can also do that. One point of clarification, the fact that it is a community level relationship means we're not talking about a single household or a single person that is high on both indicators, but rather it's the community, the percentage in that community compared to the percentage of the other indicator as well. And these are at the census tract level. So if we look at the legend over there on the right, this map is looking at the relationship between fine particulate matter and adult asthma prevalence. This is based on data from the Climate and Economic Justice Screening Tool and the CDC Places data. The CDC Places data set used for this is limited to adult asthma, which is why that is the indicator shown. And the legend on the right shows that the green areas are high prevalence of both. The white areas are low prevalence of both. And then the blue is high prevalence of asthma, but lower of particulate matter. And then the light green yellow is the opposite, lower prevalence of asthma and higher of particulate matter. So again, this shows a community level relationship between two indicators. And this type of map can help identify communities with particular vulnerabilities. And we can use it in conjunction with those air quality results to help inform our conversations. Next. Another example here is showing the relationship between energy burden and manufactured homes. So the green census tracts are areas with high percentages of both manufactured homes and high energy burden. And these represent communities that maybe could be prioritized for equitable home and energy investments. Next. So this is our starting place for data sources. These were chosen based on environmental justice and energy justice related literature, their relationship to Oregon community benefits categories, which is how they're organized here. The Oregon environmental justice community definition that is outlined in HB 4077. And there's a full list of indicators along with each data source in Appendix A of the Environmental Justice and Equity Approach write-up that is on ODO's website. I don't know if that link has been dropped in the chat yet, but that is the full write-up with extra detail about all of these analyses that Jeremy and I have been talking about. And that document has the specific feedback questions that have been repeated here on the slides as well. I think that is it from me, and we can move into Q&A. There's certainly a lot of cues.
Well, thank you both. So a couple things, then we'll move through questions. So we have a number that came up in the chat, and then I'll just ask folks if there's, is there a next slide? Yeah, so there's a couple discussion questions for this section. So I'm going to start with there's some online questions, and Jennifer, I'll come to you. So, but a couple just things to name. One, as you look through those slides, you saw the kind of questions in orange. We are asking primarily for a lot of feedback to come through the online methodology. So if you could provide written feedback to some of those specific questions, that would be really helpful. The second piece, and I know, I think Charity, you had brought this up at our last conversation, really around the distinction between kind of quote co-benefits and benefits. And so I think we're holding sensitivity to that. Co-benefits is a term that's often used, but I think for this group, for our presenters, for our team, really thinking about not just co-benefits, but benefits themselves, right? And not drawing that distinction. So I'll just name that, and particularly Charity for what you raised. So I think, Aaron, you had the first question in the chat. So I'm going to work through folks that had some chat questions, and then Jennifer, I'll come to you. So Aaron, do you want to come off mute? You had a question around the customer groups and some of the data.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. So yeah, looking at those 9 customer groups, just wondering if we have data on how many people or households are in each group, because if one group is just 100 households, but another group is 100,000, then maybe it makes more sense to focus on studying the group that's 100,000 rather than 100. So just asking that. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeremy.
Yeah, that's a good question. And these are really representative of larger groups that are pretty significant, each one of them. I don't know off the top of my head the magnitudes of those relative to one another. My colleague Angela is on the phone, who put those together. So if she has those, she could speak up. But I think that they're all pretty significant. So I wouldn't say that any one of them is a really, underrepresented group in terms of total numbers.
Yeah, Angela, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, thank you, Jeremy. So the groups were developed based on feedback that we received from all of the working groups and this group as well. And we created them using RBSA data of homes that were sampled as part of that study. Basically looking at the types of homes, the types of fuel usage. So it's not necessarily based on population because the RBSA is just a sample of homes within the state of Oregon as well as the Northwest. But I think it's certainly a good point that you're making and something we could look into as well.
Okay, thank you. And then Laura, you had posted a question in the chat that it looks like got answered. Is that sufficient around the priority areas definition?
Yeah, it's definitely helpful in terms of how those counties are identified, although I'm having trouble finding in that report which counties are the county priorities. So maybe that's a follow-up, which could be resolved in the chat.
Okay, well, let's make a note to actually identify which are the counties that then under that definition are determined to be priority counties. Thank you, Laura. So Jennifer, you had asked a process question and you have your hand up, so I'm going to call on you. So process question, I think primarily we do want folks to submit online, but jump in if you have other comments or questions.
It's a little bit longer, so I didn't want to type it, but when I was in one of the EJ working groups, I really pushed for having one of the customer groups be clearly from a COU, and I don't see that reflected here. 30% of Oregonians get our power from COUs, and one of the things that concerns me about this approach is that it seems like you're using electricity as the fuel source and federal data rather than anything Oregon specific about how electricity is produced, and that really masks cost differences and air quality in electricity production methods for the Northwest as compared to the nation as a whole, and in particular, the differences between COUs with access to the federal Columbia River power system, which is 95% carbon free, and the IOUs, which, they still are having some coal imports and using a lot more natural gas and are having to build more renewable energy to meet clean energy targets. So that there is a large difference in that. And if you're looking at if this method is supposed to be based on the cost of delivering energy, that is a key difference within our state that isn't being reflected in this that I can tell. It just seems like it's using your US electricity production costs. So I guess that's one issue that I was wondering about, and hoping we can get a better breakdown of the IOU and COU coverage areas in the state, and then looking at some of the corresponding electricity resources, including the imports and so forth.
Yeah, thank you, Jennifer. Jeremy, is that you?
Yeah, that's a great set of questions, and one that affords me the opportunity to expand a little bit on how we're doing the analysis. So when it comes to what kind of energy is being used to supply customers, then it is definitely Oregon specific. So when we're doing our modeling, we're looking at an eastern zone and western zone to Oregon, and then the access to all of the states around Oregon as well. And how does that change over time? So the change in the cost of providing energy to customers is definitely determined by what is the existing energy mix in Oregon and how that is evolving in the future. But the point that you're raising, where we're using federal databases, that is for characterizing what are customers paying today. And I think that you're raising a good point where we can be more specific than that on COU versus IOU. We don't want to get into all of the different rate designs out there, because then we're looking at, rate determinants for customers on what is their peak load and the shape of their load, and then how those rates might change over time. But we do definitely want to get a good estimate of what customers are paying today for energy in general, and a COU versus IOU split might be something that we should consider if the rate is very different between those two.
Well, I think that, as I understand it, it's based on the cost of delivering the energy to the customers. And because we have access to the federal Columbia River power system, that is going to necessarily be different than the IOUs. And that's the bulk of most of our, at least for my utilities in the municipal space, we're 100% BPA, which, so.
Yeah.
Sorry, Jeremy, we're going to add.
I was just going to say we will take that into account, and Angela and I will get together and talk about what our options are there.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Jennifer. Brian and Charity both had questions around energy type. So Brian, maybe if you want to kind of reiterate your question, really around the utilization of just electric and gas, not propane. Charity, I think you lifted up that there's a lot of still homes that are using gas heated, oil heated homes. Brian, do you want to start though first?
Yeah, obviously representing the propane industry, one of the glaring things that I saw on that slide for the customer use cases is there is no representation of propane usage across the state. And that's a little bit concerning to me. I would also argue, or maybe look for some input from people representing natural gas on the rural parts of the states and the availability of natural gas. It's our experience that the majority of those customers are using propane because natural gas is not available.
Awesome, thanks, Brian. And then Charity, did you, just before Jeremy or team answers, Charity, did you want to just lift up your point as well?
Yeah, I was just also getting why the assumption that single family homes are gas users. And it's similar thing to Brian, like why we see a lot of different types of a fuel source for single family homes, including still a lot of oil heated homes in Portland, especially in low income households. So it just struck me as strange that the assumption is that all single family homes are gas.
Okay. Jeremy?
Do you want
Yeah.
me to take this one?
Yeah, go ahead, Angela.
Yeah, go ahead, Angela.
So the primary heating source is based on the majority of homes heated within that group by that fuel type, but isn't representative of all of the different fuel types that we see within that particular group. So we are actually calculating an energy use intensity for all fuel types for all groups that'll be used within Jeremy's modeling. We wanted to provide the primary heating type for the majority of households in that group for decision making as an illustrative example of what types of heating you see within those groups. But Jeremy will actually get EUIs for all fuel types for all of those customer groups. And then Jeremy, do you want to add how you'll use the EUIs? I think that might also get to calculating the cost of energy by groups and fuel types.
Yeah, I think there's a question that feedback from this group would be useful on here, where when we're doing our 5 different customer types, then I think it's useful to be considering those to be an actual customer. So a customer that has a particular level of energy use for the home that they have, and the type of heating is one or the other. It's natural gas or propane. so that that's relatable to look at that customer and say, okay, the customer with these particular characteristics is changing in this manner going into the future. But I think that the type of heating could be an important variable here, that when we are looking at our 5 customers, maybe we need representation of those other types of heating as well. And so if that is an important driver that we should factor into the choice of those 5, then we can definitely do that. Include heating oil, propane as a customer type.
Good. Thank you, Jeremy. Yeah, Angela?
I was just going to say, agree with Jeremy. That's easy for us to create a customer group for that. And I think that's a good point that was brought up.
Okay, thank you. So Elaine, you had I think a technical question around an interactive map. Do you want to say anything else about that?
No, just a question, I guess curiosity of if that's been considered, it would be a valuable tool, but that's, maybe wildly out of scope and cost. So but curious, it would be very helpful and handy to have.
I can start, and then if anyone from Odo wants to add in. We have talked about this, and CETI does have some interactive maps that I'll put in the chat for the whole Northwest. We have 5 of them that are very similar methodology. Same person created them, our research fellow, Mariah. So we have the ability to do it. It is most likely out of scope for this project, but the data set and the shape files that will be created for these maps could be taken in that direction. But I don't want to speak for Odo in terms of what is possible in the future.
Okay. Odo, do you want to, Edith?
Yeah, I mean, maybe I can just add that we started to have this discussion when we realized that if we were to have an online interactive mapping tool, we actually already have one with the ERISA tool, the Renewable Energy Siting Assessment tool. And and then we have other purposes for which an interactive map might be useful. So I'll just say it's a bigger discussion within Odo of how we could beef up the mapping that we already have and build on it, and also incorporate the work that we're doing in the energy strategy. But as Ruby said, we sort of have determined that given the timeline and the budget, it's out of scope for the energy strategy itself. But it's a really good point, Elaine, and something that we're looking into.
Thanks, Edith. Let's go Tucker, then Jeff, then Aaron.
Awesome, thank you. And Jeremy did a good job of kind of responding to Jennifer Jolly's thoughts on the need for just the COU kind of analysis and the Federal Columbia River Power System. I really just want to second what she said. I think it's going to be really valuable as we look at different parts of the state and we're unpacking energy burdens and trying to understand the cost of energy for certain Oregonians, but also what they're getting for their energy from a carbon-free perspective. And I think it'd be fascinating to see, and I'm not necessarily advocating for comparison between IOUs and COUs as much as I just am advocating that this process needs to have a comprehensive understanding of what it means to be connected to the Federal Columbia River Power System. For all of the groups, when you look at the slideshow that we just went through, when you're looking at your Justice 40 groups and some of your most energy burden, your lowest income, oldest homes, when you start really unpacking that, what are the benefits? And we talk about co-benefits in this group. What are the benefits that we're seeing, even beyond just the fact that we're able to keep our rates low or that we have incredible reliability? But what else are they getting for that, because it is so close to carbon free? And what does that mean for those parts of the state? And so I think Jennifer said it well. Jeremy certainly gave a pretty good response, and it seems like you all may incorporate that or take that under consideration. But I just wanted to second that, because I think from the COU perspective, which there's a lot of us in the state serving the geographic majority of the state, that there's maybe nothing more critical than understanding the real value of those projects on the Columbia and Snake Rivers. So that's my adder there.
Yeah, appreciate you lifting that up, Tucker. Jeff, I can't hear you. Is that just me? No?
So can't hear Jeff, just to confirm that. Yeah,
no? Sorry, Jeff. Now, let's see if we can, let's come back to you in a second. Aaron, figure you, and then Jeff, start hitting some buttons and see if we can.
Thanks.
Nope.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. I'll answer Brian's question really quick. A consumer-owned utility and an investor-owned utility. So the investor-owned ones, are Portland General and Pacific Power, and all the others are consumer. But my comment is actually, I agree with what Jennifer and Tucker were mentioning about the consumer-owned utility perspective. But my main thing is, I wonder if it'd be useful to study new, efficient multifamily housing, because that's probably going to be a greater proportion of the future housing stock in the state, as we build more apartments. And I think, policymakers might find it really useful to see how do those energy bills compare to a detached home, as we pursue this energy transition. So potentially that could be another customer group to include.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Jeff, let's try again. Shoot, we can't hear you now. You might maybe pause.
Matter, but let's go for it. So I need to preface this. I had to take an emergency call for 3 minutes, so it's possible that Angela covered this when I was away. But I'm aware. I remember that maybe 2 years ago, 2 legislative sessions ago, the state legislators created a pathway to create an environmental justice mapping tool to provide geospatial information about EJ impacts and so on. My guess is that might not be available yet, but I'm wondering if it is, and if so, is it being utilized?
So Jeff, you were very quiet on my end. I think I heard a bit about the environmental justice mapping tool. I'm looking at team members to help me fill in the blanks.
So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to put it in the chat, my question in the chat.
Okay, that's great. Thank you, Jeff. You did sound a little better when you said you were going to put it in the chat. It sounded a little louder. But
So let me try again. So the state legislature 2 years ago funded an environmental justice mapping tool, and it's through the Oregon Environmental Justice Task Force, I think it's called. Oregon Environmental Justice, what was it called? Task Force. Yeah.
EJ Council now. Yep.
Okay, here we go. I'm wondering if that is available yet, if that is done, if it's operational, and if so, if it was being used as one of your mapping tools.
So I don't know if other folks know this. I will just note, even though I'm rolling off the Environmental Justice Council, I have served, so I've taken off my other hat, my facilitator hat. Jeff, it hasn't been developed yet. So the Environmental Justice Council, working with state agencies and some other external partners, have not kind of put that tool into effect. So it's kind of a wait and see. It may be a valuable resource, depending on the timeline of that. It may be a valuable resource in the future, but it's not available yet.
Okay.
Great. Thank you for that question. Brian, you had, I think, added another question in the chat and had a hand that flashed up and then went down. I see you got your one question answered around the acronyms. So just a reminder for everyone around your acronyms, but you had a question around the geospatial mapping indicators, Brian.
Yeah.
Air
quality, wildfires, yeah.
Yeah, just one of the concerns being a resident in Central Oregon, obviously, I like a lot of people the last several years on the eastern and central side of the state, there's a real significant difference in air quality during the wildfire months versus the remainder of the year. And my concern would be if with some of the data that we're looking at, is that skewing the data of air quality that's not related to energy consumption or energy use?
Thanks, Brian.
That's
Ruby?
really, yeah, thanks. Really good question. And we heard a lot of similar concerns about the air quality modeling not capturing any effects of wildfire smoke. I don't off the top of my head know what data sources we've been looking at, but we have been looking at various data sources to use either to look at wildfire risk and wildfire vulnerability, or as you're suggesting, seasonal air quality changes in different areas. So that's a place where the mapping can be really useful in a way that the air quality modeling has limitations. So thanks for that.
Yeah, thanks, Ruby. And then Rebecca, you had asked a question around how tribal, if at all, tribal communities are reflected in customer groups or how that's been raised. Ruby, you want to
I
start?
can answer,
Yep.
yeah, unless Rebecca has anything to add. It's a really good point and a good flag for us to clarify because they are not reflected in the customer groups. The data comes from the NIA's RBSA, as Angela said, the Residential Building Stock Assessment. And there are no tribal communities represented in that sample size. So that's a good question and a good point of clarification.
So Rebecca, I don't want to speak for you, I guess, then what does that mean, Ruby, for how tribal populations then are part of the analysis or conversation? And Rebecca, jump in if I'm misrepresenting kind of where you're going with that question.
You know, I can't unmute Rebecca either, so we're gonna have to figure out what's going on with Rebecca.
Okay, so, but I guess, so maybe, Rebecca, maybe I'm getting out of bounds here, but I think the question around then, if not reflected in customer groups, then where do tribal communities specifically show up? And I would say, you know, maybe tribal nations is part of that question versus kind of indigenous peoples kind of captured amongst some of these other population or customer groups.
I can jump in. This is Ruchi. Since Ben did a hat exchange, I can also just say that I'm a board member of NIA. I'm the Oregon representative, and the question around whether NIA's future data gathering could further be tailored to tribal communities has been asked, and I think they're exploring that. But the data set, as I understand it, that's being used does not have that level of specificity or analysis. And then separately, our ODO team has been conducting some specific tribal government to state government relations meetings, a series of formal notification letters to invite each of the 9 federally recognized tribes to participate in our work. And we've had a few tribes take us up on that. And we've been trying to explore with them how this analysis could be most useful to their tribal communities. I don't think that we have that kind of information in this version of the draft, but are seeking that kind of input from each tribe right now. And I have a kind of curiosity back to SETI, so I might turn it back to you, Ruby. Because the 9 federally recognized tribes span a lot of different household types within Oregon. Some are on reservation, some are off reservation. Tribal members may live in different parts of the country, in fact. And given that we're limited to 5 representative households, it might be helpful to sort of think through whether these 5 representative households have representation on reservation or not. As we know, there's a mix of fuel types that are available to different tribal communities. Some are in, you know, PG territory, and some are in a COU territory. Some, the Cow Creek, actually run their own utility as a co-op, you know. So it might be helpful if we don't have a specific representative tribal community, at least to surface which tribes might fall into the ones that are selected to provide that kind of visibility.
Yeah, that's really helpful, Ruchi. And I don't know for Jeremy's SETI team, if you all have kind of seen this in other spaces, places where you've done this level of analysis and how you've incorporated tribal populations, but that might give some illustration.
So I think one thing that we can do is think about within the data sets that we do have, what are matching up well with potential tribal building types as well, and then see whether there's good matches there, so that it's applicable beyond the bounds of what the NIA data set is giving us. So I think that would be an approach we could move forward with.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, thank you, Rebecca. I'm sorry we can't get you off mute, so I hope I represented your the intention of your question appropriately. Jeff, I don't know if that's an old hand or a new hand. Is that your old hand? Oh, that looks like an old hand wave off. Okay, thank you. So I'll just pause. Thank you for the questions that have come through in the chat. I think I caught up with all the chat questions. We've got I guess we've gotten some clarifying. We've gotten some missing. We've made some concerns. I don't want to leave this conversation if there's things you really like about this without naming some of that. So maybe I'll leave all the questions open, but if there's particular things that are resonating with you in this, don't be afraid to name that as well. And Rebecca, thank you for your validation in the chat.
Ben, can I ask a question to the group?
Yep.
First, I just want to acknowledge that I heard a lot of feedback on groups that we could consider, and I appreciate that. That's really helpful. I'm wondering if there's any groups that people see on the list that they like and would want us to keep.
Do you want to go back to the slide that has that? Maybe that's. Yep, thank you. So now, based on that question, is there, and we are asking y'all, right, and these are in no particular order, by the way, so they're not already prioritized in any particular fashion. There is a question that we are seeking feedback around 5 and 9 that should be prioritized, but I think to Angela's question, like, are there ones that are jumping out to you or that you'd like to articulate in this space beyond the online request for information?
Yeah, and Ben, we should have mentioned this earlier. We did have the EJ working group prioritize these groups and identify the top 5 that they would really like to keep. And just interested if there, are groups here that others are really interested in as well.
Yeah, thank you, Angela.
And I'll just add, it might be easier to add those into the chat. So if you want to, we keep the chats after these meetings are done and use them to inform our comments. So if you wanted to throw them in there, that's great.
That's helpful, Jessica. We're waiting with bated breath for Aaron to type his. I'd keep calling. So we'll see what comes out of that.
I just want to remind everyone, sorry, Ben, that I'm also looking to see what Aaron would keep. I just wanted to remind everyone that the 27th is the deadline for written comments, so you have another week to provide comments. So understand that today we're just having this conversation. I know that we emailed around this consultation a few weeks ago when we opened it up, but also that everybody's busy. But we set that deadline so that we would not start to run into Thanksgiving weekend. So comments would be just before.
Thanks, Edith. And Josh, thanks for putting the link to the Power App portal in the chat. So folks, you can begin right now with some of your reflections. Thank you, Aaron, for giving some input. Feel free, folks, to add to that. I don't know what I've been calling it, but comment portal. So now I have the language correct. Okay. So let's move back. We can go back to the discussion questions. I'll just ask maybe one more moment for folks. We are a little bit ahead of time. Got a few more minutes, but anything that feels urgent for now, and otherwise we'll send our SETI team on their way.
The only thing I would add, this is Tucker with
Yeah, Tucker.
ORECA. The only thing that I would add is just, and I know that we can submit this through comments, but I'm going to say it while I have you all here. I really like the idea of focusing on rural household types. I think some low income manufactured homes. I'm just thinking of where a lot of our co-ops serve, where a lot of our COUs serve, certainly those areas. So would not want to see rural be excluded within those 5. So that's my thoughts. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Tucker. And in lines with, I think, some of the comments around the EJ definition from HB 47.7, Brian and Charity's comments around ensuring the the visibility of rural households that are using different types of energy, and Jeremy, your reflections earlier. Thanks for that, Tucker. Laura?
The only other thing I was thinking about is I still haven't, sorry if I missed it in the chat, if there's a list of the high priority areas, but I'm wondering how that overlaps with the other categories. And could that mean either taking that one out, or if that one's going to cover some of the existing categories? What's the intersection there?
Yeah, so I don't know, team, how fast we get the counties that fall under the definition of high priority counties. But Laura, I think your comment and question around kind of how do we kind of overlap those is solid. So we'll ask folks if if that can come up today, but we certainly, Laura, we'll capture it as a follow-up.
I am putting it in the chat right now where to find the table, not the list of the counties, but which page it's on, Laura. But I think the point of kind of doing that overlay is a good one, and something that we'll be doing as we incorporate all the feedback we've heard. We'd want to make sure that the 5 customer groups that we end up with are actually a good representation. And so if it ends up being a really close overlap, we would use one over the other.
Great. Thanks, Ruby. Patrick, did you come on screen because you have a question and comment, or you just showing your face?
Just got some technical difficulties resolved, so switched over to the web app.
Okay. Sometimes people put their camera on when they're ready to ask a question, so try to read the space. Andrew, jump in.
Hi, Andrew from 1000 Friends of Oregon. I just wanted to let you all know I've been listening to this conversation through my phone, so I have been here. I just had a question about these different categories and wondering kind of what the backwards compatibility of it would be if, for example, if you have these different groups of people and but you wanted to see that, how that would map onto a particular county or something like that. Would it be possible after the modeling is done to kind of be able to take the data and say, well, my county has, this many low-income multifamily renters. My county has this many single-family homes, that type of thing, or my city or my jurisdiction, and be able to kind of bring that back to kind of cobble together some data about how it might look on a region that's less than the two broader buckets in Oregon, if that's possible, or if that's just kind of a too crazy of an idea, or too fraught with overlaps and just not able to make the data work that way.
Is that a Jeremy question?
So I think that the frequency with which we see a particular kind of household across Oregon would be data that we would have, and we could map back to say, and I think it would work the way of say we had 100,000 of a particular type of household. Where do those 100,000 fall in terms of distribution across the state? So I think it would work that way. What we wouldn't be able to do is say, for a particular county, how many of different types of households are in that county, and what would be the impact across all of them, because we would need to do a much more comprehensive analysis on our site that would include the whole population and that whole distribution. Whereas we're trying to show these sort of example 5 vignettes instead of doing a really comprehensive rate analysis. But I think that the sort of geospatial mapping of the categories back to where they occur is definitely something that we could do. And I asked Ruby whether that seems reasonable in the mapping exercise.
Yeah, Ruby?
I think it definitely does, and I'm glad you brought it up, Andrew, because this was a thought we had back in the very beginning of this project about how the energy wallet and the mapping can be used together. And so I like your framing of kind of the backwards mapping of it. And yeah, I agree with Jeremy that is possible to say, of this customer group, where do we see them, or with what frequency, prevalence, do we see them throughout the state of Oregon?
Okay, that was, yeah, the question about tribal communities made me think of that as maybe a way to kind of bring to map if there's a community that's not representative, or like, for example, if the rural category is broad but includes other types of households, if there was a way that you know, a particular county or rural community could then take these buckets and then kind of bring them back and see how they map onto their own community to get a sense of how it might affect that specific area. So that was, yeah, okay. Thank you. That's my question there.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. Well, we really appreciate this conversation. Again, the portal link is in the chat. Thank you, Josh, for throwing that in. So please, you know, folks, please take some time to respond. Hopefully this was a good primer, and thank you, Jeremy. Thank you, Ruby. Thank you, Angela, for joining us today. Really appreciate the work you've done and just your ongoing ability to be so responsive to what the group has raised. So we'll say goodbye to you all, or at least bye for now, and we'll move on to the next part of our agenda. We'll take about 15 minutes, and then we'll have a break and keep going. So Edith, I'm going to pass it to you.
Thanks, Ben. And I'm kind of sorry to leave that conversation. I feel like in many ways that's the most interesting, weedy part of our conversation today, but also very important for us to talk about and get your thoughts on how we are thinking about structuring the next phase of engagement as we move into having policy discussions. So that's kind of going to be the focus of my next two slides. I have a couple of timelines. I would like to leave everybody with a sense of generally the timing and what we plan to be doing during that time. And then after the break, we'll return and we'll dig a little bit deeper, particularly into the working groups, which are, as they did in the first phase where we were informing the modeling, the working groups will again play a really important role in working through and helping us work through how we take those modeling results and the insights that we get and have a conversation about recommended policy actions and policies that are working, where there are gaps, what we might need to achieve our climate energy goals. So if we go to the next slide, this is kind of a busy slide, but I think it's really important to talk through. When we talk about phase two, we've kind of developed shorthand since this is such a complex project. So phase one was the engagement to inform the modeling. And in a way that a little bit of that is continuing with today's conversation about these additional analytical tools. Phase two is the conversation around policy recommendations. So the modeling results will be the starting point really for those policy discussions. So right now we're in really this preparatory phase to get ready to kick off a meeting where we, and by we, I mean Jeremy, who just left the meeting, presents the results of the modeling and of the analysis, including some of the complementary analysis that you just heard about. And that webinar is really necessary to kick off phase two, because the whole purpose of the modeling and of the technical analysis is to give us some insights and to inform a conversation about what direction we are taking as a state and what we might need to get there. So this timeline gives you some of the highlights. I'm going to go top to bottom and left to right. I'm going to skip over October, November, December. We're already almost in December, but just so you can see, we have this monthly cadence where we're meeting with you. We have a meeting coming up of our interagency steering group. We also are continuing ongoing tribal consultation throughout. So in a way, it doesn't really start in October. It started before, but we wanted to make sure you could see the word there. And we also have continued meetings of the EJ and Equity Working Group, the Environmental Justice and Equity Working Group. That group continued to meet after the other working groups ended, because of the importance of developing these additional modeling tools and the importance of getting the insights from that group to helping us define things like how we might structure 5 representative households, what type of analysis would be most useful to look at things like energy burden. If I go to the top, you see we have webinar in late January. We don't have a date for that yet, but we will soon, and we'll reach out to you once we have that. We're still working out exactly what the timing will be to finalize the modeling work, which has to finish before we can present what we found. We will continue to have monthly meetings with the advisory group there in blue, and with the interagency steering group, which has a little, we don't really use that acronym, but for purposes of saving space, we just called it the IASG. And then we have this big square here, which is the policy working groups. And like I said, I'm going to elaborate a little bit more about the policy working groups shortly, but I just want to make the point here that we have a longer time frame than we had last time around for these meetings. We anticipate having several meetings in this kind of 3-ish month period, and both the meetings of the policy working groups, the advisory group, the interagency steering group, the EJ and equity group. We also have some listening sessions planned. All of this will be building towards a webinar in early June, we expect, where we would present draft policy recommendations for feedback. And then you can see in July, we also have a jobs study that will be presenting the results from. The job study is going to take a little bit longer because the analysis can't begin until we have the modeling results. Essentially, it's going to look at the employment effects of the different scenarios as we've modeled them, and what the different pathways mean for jobs in Oregon. And so that study comes a little bit later, but will also inform policy discussions and recommendations, but it's just something that we're going to have to talk about a little bit later in the year, but still before we draft the report and finalize the report for the governor and legislature. So that's the general timeline. If we go to the next one, I have a more detailed timeline here for the working groups that I just want to show before we take a break, and then this can all marinate while you take a break, and we'll come back and get into more details. So here, as you saw on the last slide, there's roughly 3 months in here. There's 4 months on the screen, but really we kick off in late January with that meeting to present the modeling results. And I just want to start with the first and last meetings. So as with the last round of working group meetings, we expect to have a plenary meeting where we bring all the working groups together to kick off the discussions on policy, and also a final meeting where we present where we landed, what we did with what we heard, have a conversation about draft policy recommendations before we come to you and before we put them out for comment. So in between those bookend meetings, each working group will meet twice. And those meetings will really be to work more through the model results, policy gaps and opportunities, and to work on developing some recommended policy actions to inform the policy recommendations. I'm just going to point out a few differences here compared to how we structured the working groups last time around. First of all, there are 5 working groups rather than 8, so it's not a mistake here that there are fewer working groups. Last time around, we were kind of informing data and assumptions and inputs going into the model. This time around, we're talking policy, and we found a way to, we think, consolidate a little bit into fewer groups. We've also added one more meeting. We got a lot of feedback last time around in phase 1 that the timeline was really compressed and that there wasn't enough time to have a really robust conversation. So we've taken that on board, and we agree. And we've added another meeting in there. We also plan to have slightly longer meetings, so we're expecting the meetings to be 3 hours long, which allows for more discussion, and we're going to work really hard to structure those meetings to have a really engaging conversation. We won't present for 3 hours, I promise. And we are also providing a bit more time between the working groups to allow for some content development, and we are likely going to assign some homework to the working group so that there's also some work happening behind the scenes that informs the next meeting in between meetings. So this is kind of, again, just a high level timeline of how we're looking to structure the working groups, and I'll get into a lot more detail after the break. But I think it's time for us to all go get some water or coffee and a snack.
Yes, it is. And so we're a couple minutes behind, or I mean ahead. Sorry. So let me put that in the universe. Let's, you want to take 10 minutes? We'll come back at 10:35. We'll continue the conversation on next steps. So let's take 10. We'll see you at 10:35. Thanks all. Okay, well, hopefully we are at 10:35. Hopefully you enjoyed a refill of coffee or water or whatever the heck gets you through. Hey, Gen Bs, welcome. I think we missed you at introductions earlier, so hello. So welcome back, folks. Jen, do you want to say hi though? I know you didn't get to introduce yourself earlier.
Oh, sure. Good morning, everyone. Jen Bees with Port of Portland. Sorry for the little bit late arrival.
That's all right, we called you out appropriately, being late. Thanks for being here. All right, Edith, back to you. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Ben. And I see a question already popped up during the break in the chat. Jennifer, I think that I'll be answering many parts of your question as I go through the presentation. As Jessica just wrote, so we're thinking in the same speed, Jessica. So I'm just going to run through and talk a bit about how we're. I'll get to the working groups in a moment, but I want to start at a high level about how we're structuring the overall engagement, and then I'll get into some more details on the working group. So the next slide, I promise this is the only kind of mind. Oh no, sorry, it's the one after this. This slide's simple. So you all have seen this slide before, and it's because it's the same as we presented to you in our first meeting last July. I essentially took that slide and updated it. And the point that I want to make here is that we expect to have the same engagement structures or consultative structures that we had before. So we are continuing with tribal consultation. As Ruchi described in a bit more detail before the break, we have you all, we'll continue to meet with you on a monthly basis. We will be forming working groups. We have an interagency steering group. I'll just point out that in that description of the interagency steering group, we mention kind of other agencies, and that category of other agencies is really important when we get into the policy discussions. And I just want to let you all know that we recognize that and that we are talking to other agencies beyond the short list that you see here. And we also plan to have some listening sessions so that we have a venue for anybody who's not participating in one of the other groups to have an opportunity to have their voice heard. And we really are very much in listening mode in the listening sessions. And all of these different engagement spaces inform our thinking. And I think that's also important to point out. Okay, so the next one is the one that I was going to comment is kind of the mind bender. You should have seen this before our comms team cleaned it up. So I just want to, I wanted to demonstrate graphically kind of a flow that's going to happen over the next few months. And this is kind of how we structured the first phase too, but I just think that it's helpful for you all to see where you are in these green boxes, where our meetings fall within this framework, and how all these different groups are relating to each other on a timeline, but also in terms of kind of the flow of information. And I mean, this is a graphic representation and things won't always be exactly the way that they're drawn, but I think that this is pretty accurate, especially when I look back and see how this worked during phase one. So the working groups are here in gray, and I sort of highlight them first because in a way they're sort of the engine that's driving forward the discussion as we talk through the modeling results, and then what policies we have and where there might be gaps, and then we start talking about recommended policy actions and have conversations to inform that, and then finally we have a plenary session where we anticipate that we would present policy recommendations, draft policy recommendations for discussion based on all of the discussions that we've had throughout. But of course, it's not just the working group that's meeting and having the conversations. We will start actually on the far left with the model results. We'll have that webinar. We'll talk to you all about the modeling results. We'll talk to the interagency group about the modeling results. And then we'll have that first working group plenary session where we'll talk about the modeling results. And I'll talk in a bit more detail in a moment about how we envision each of these, or kind of what we envision each of these working group meetings focusing on. But what I want to point out here is that, we'll have a working group meeting, and then in that same month, we'll have an interagency meeting, and we'll also have a meeting with you all. We tend to try to have, but it doesn't always work out, and now is a perfect example. We tend to try to have the interagency meeting before we talk to you all, because it gives us a chance to check in with our sister agencies before we meet and have a discussion here. this month it didn't work out that way, and our interagency meeting is actually in a couple of weeks. But there's kind of this feedback loop that's happening, right? And what we hear in one place, I'll point out the public listening session on the bottom. What we hear in that listening session is also going to help inform our conversation in the working groups. And so there is kind of a conversation happening here, and we at Odo are taking on what we're hearing, and we're incorporating it into our thinking and into the materials that we're preparing and into how we talk about things in the next meeting. I also want to point out that there's a unique value to each engagement structure, and that's why we have several of them in terms of the perspectives and the information that we'll hear, but also just kind of the purpose of each group. So, the working groups are they're the ones that really get in the weeds. We anticipate kind of 3-hour meetings to really talk in depth about the modeling results and to talk policy. The interagency and advisory groups, we meet with you all on a monthly basis. And that means that you're our early stop along the way. Today is a good example of an early stop along the way to the next phase of engagement, where there's an opportunity to talk about how we're planning on doing things and get some feedback. And you're also kind of the last stop before we have that webinar where we present draft policy recommendations and put that out for public comment. And there's also kind of a unique role to each group. So the interagency group is really there to ensure alignment with existing regulations, laws, processes. Different agencies are, as you well know, have different regulatory responsibilities, and we at Odo have a view of the entire energy system, but we certainly aren't responsible for implementing all of the policies relating to the energy system. And it's really important to check in with our sister agencies to make sure that we are understanding the full picture. You all are our thermometer on the general temperature around what we're doing. You're also a place where we get very specific feedback that's really helpful. And I also see this as a forum where we can be held accountable for what we've done, what we've heard. You all ask good questions. Sometimes you ask hard questions, and I think that's a really valuable contribution to this whole project that this group brings. So I think that I just kind of wanted to show this structure and these interactions so that you could see a little bit more of how the different ways that we're engaging relate to each other. And I'll just point out that, towards the end of this whole process, we plan to issue draft policy recommendations. So that's where we will be issuing something akin to a straw proposal. That's not my favorite term, but there'll be draft recommendations out for public comment. And that's before we get to the final report drafting. And that's really by design. We have been talking about this quite a bit and recognize that the policy recommendations are a really important part of the energy strategy. They're not the whole thing, but they're really important because they're sort of the action points for the energy strategy. And it's really important to get provide enough time to get buy-in on what we've come up with, have an opportunity to explain kind of what we've heard, what we've done with it, and to get feedback before we start to wordsmith a final report. It's really important to us that we have a really robust engagement around the policy recommendations. And that's why those are coming earlier than you might expect and before we draft the final report. Okay, so if we go to the next slide.
Well, just Edith, maybe just pausing on that slide real quick, because Jennifer, I think your question hopefully is kind of answered within this flow chart, but I just want to make sure that you feel like it makes sense in terms of what you were bringing, in terms of the.
I just was wondering if we were going to get an idea of where Odo is leaning before we start commenting, or is it just going to be a free for all based on the modeling? So that's kind of where I'm going.
Yeah, so I think, Jennifer, I have a couple of slides that might be helpful to dig into that a little more. And then I'd be really interested to hear kind of follow-on questions that you have from that.
Okay.
If we go to the next slide, this is where I start to get into the working groups and how we're structuring them. So On the right, you have the previous working groups that we had. We had 8 groups, and on the left, you have the working groups that we plan to form for the second phase of engagement. So we, as I already said, will continue to meet with the environmental justice and equity group. We also have a group that will focus on energy efficiency and distributed energy resources. By the way, the next slide defines these, so I'm going to fly through and then go to the definitions or the scope. We'll have a group focused on developing clean electricity generation and transmission. We'll have one focused on low carbon fuel solutions, and we'll have a transportation electrification working group. And I'll just say that, you know, we talked about just carrying over the previous working groups, but we realized that since we're having policy discussions, we kind of thought about how those discussions might go. And we think that this revised structure will be really helpful in kind of framing up the topics in a way that makes sense when we start digging into looking at specific policy recommendations. And I'll also mention that we're in the process of forming these groups, and that means that we may not have all the same people in the room, even when we have the same organization involved. I think that policy discussions are just by nature a little bit different, and so we anticipate that there may be some different people from the same organization in the room who are better placed to inform policy discussions. And I just wanted to point that out because I think it's important to just say out loud, because otherwise there could be some confusion about what we mean that we're changing the groups and what about the people who were in the previous working groups. And I'll talk a little bit about the process in a moment. So if we go to the next slide, this one provides just a little bit more elaboration on the working groups and the scope that we have in mind. So for environmental justice and equity, this group really plays a twofold role because of just the fact that environmental justice and equity considerations live in all of the working groups, really. So one of the roles is in providing environmental justice and equity perspectives in the other working groups. And we are working with that group to identify people who might be able to participate in the other working groups in addition to this one, which we recognize as a time commitment, but we think provides a lot of value. And this group also meets separately, and in that kind of dedicated forum, they evaluate analysis and develop recommendations relating to environmental justice and equity. And the meetings that we've had leading up to issuing the consultation document for the energy wallet and for the air quality and geospatial mapping, those have been really valuable conversations. And I'll just add that they're recorded and online in case anybody's curious and didn't have an opportunity to join when those meetings happened. The energy efficiency and distributed energy resources group covers primarily residential and commercial sectors and is really focused on everything that's on the customer side of the meter. So that's the line that we're proposing for this group. And some of you will appreciate why that is. And then we have a developing clean electricity generation transmission group. And there, when we talk about electricity generation, we're suggesting that everything in front of the meter would go in there. Realize that there might be a little bit of overlap between these topics, but trying to make very clear delineations at the start and then handle those case by case. So this group will also discuss transmission and development needs and barriers, competing priorities to those to development, things like land use, for example. I think land use will be a really big part of the discussions in the clean electricity generation and transmission group. We then have a low carbon fuels group, and that one will really focus on the best application of low carbon fuels used in buildings, industry, and transportation. So it's really cross-sectoral. And also we'll look at barriers and potential solutions to production and distribution of clean fuels. And then we'll have a transportation electrification group. And this one will really focus on light, medium, and heavy duty zero emission vehicles. So that includes both battery electric and hydrogen fuel cell vehicles. So you can see there's a little bit of overlap with hydrogen between low carbon fuels and transportation electrification. We'll be discussing things like charging and fueling infrastructure, and the topic of vehicle miles traveled will also be discussed in this group. And you might remember that's one of the sensitivities that we proposed running was to look at less, a reduction in vehicle miles traveled and how that compares to not reducing vehicle miles traveled. So if we go to the next slide, excuse me. So this is where we're getting a little bit more into what we might cover meeting by meeting. And Jennifer, where I think that I might be helping respond a little bit to the question that you asked about kind of what specifically we're going to be talking about, how we'll structure these conversations. I'll start by saying, just reminding us all that we really see this as an Oregon energy strategy and not a Oregon Department of Energy strategy. And we really see these working groups as a key kind of engagement mechanism to inform what comes out of the energy strategy. It's really important to have this dialogue, and I would say that the dialogue is almost more important than the final report that's printed on paper at the end. So the first meeting group will be a plenary meeting. I'm just going to step back for a second and say that we're in the process of working out all of these details. I'm going to be a little bit general today. So if I'm being a little general, that's why we still don't have like actual slides ready to explain how we're going to tee up each of the conversations, and we don't have modeling results yet. But I think that this is a helpful framework to talk through and a helpful level at which to have a conversation today. So the first meeting will be a plenary meeting, and in the first kind of two parts of the meeting here that you see, we really want to make sure that we're just bringing everybody along. And so we want to make sure that the working groups are understanding what came out of the model, understanding how to think about the modeling results. We'll have the webinar before this first working group meeting, and it will be kind of mandatory homework for the working group participants to have watched that webinar. But we will also summarize to some extent the findings in that first meeting, just to make sure, to reinforce and make sure that everybody's coming along and understanding what's coming out of the modeling. And again, we just want to make sure that everybody is understanding how we're anticipating rolling out these meetings, what the schedule is, what the role of the working groups is. And then we anticipate likely breaking out. So having several kind of breakout sessions by working group in that first meeting. So there's a plenary portion and then a breakout. And that's where we would start talking about priority areas for policy discussion. And the way that we've been talking about doing that is really to come, and I would say this throughout the working groups. We're not going to just come in and say, what do you think? Because that doesn't lead to a particularly productive discussion. We're anchoring the conversations in the modeling results and in the insights that we've extracted from the modeling results. We're having a conversation about that. And we're also proposing a way to structure the conversations. This is, this is a really broad area, but it's the whole energy system. And so the goal really of that first meeting of that box that you see, priority areas for policy discussion, is really for us to propose a structure to have the conversations, to understand people's priorities and what's kind of floating to the top for them, and to see whether the structure that we're proposing will work and whether it covers the various concerns and priorities and areas of interest that people have in the different working groups. So then we have meeting two, and meeting two would be each of the working groups meeting separately. So it's really one meeting per group in that second meeting. And we anticipate that this is the meeting where we would really dig in to what the modeling results tell us about costs and benefits, both costs and benefits relating to energy. So we'll look at the different scenarios and get a sense of the different ways that the energy system responds to different risks that we build into the model and different potential realities that might occur. But we're also looking at non-energy costs and benefits and understanding some of the types of details that we talked about today when we were talking about household energy wallet. And I think that that'll be a really important conversation to have. And again, we'll have a starting point, we'll have slides, we'll have insights that we come with, but we only have the perspective that we have as Odo, and it'll be different than the perspective in the room. And we want to make sure that we bring other people's perspectives into the room and answer their hard questions. We anticipate that we'll also get into a discussion of policy gaps in that second meeting. So once we've talked about, or better, we kind of dug into the costs and benefits of what we're seeing coming out of the model, it'll be really important to say, all right, well, if the model's telling us that it makes sense to do this thing, what policies do we have right now that are driving that or not driving that? What do we have in place? What might be missing? What are the gaps? And so we anticipate having a discussion that starts to lead into not yet concrete recommendations, but identifying where the policy needs are essentially. And then the homework that we anticipate for this meeting is to have the working group members elaborate on those policy gaps. We recognize that there's a limit to the depth of conversation that you can have in a room with 20, 30, 40 people, and that it's really hard for everybody to feel like they have a space to speak. We'll do our best, but we also recognize that thinking doesn't happen on the fly in 3-hour chunks. People need time to reflect and to think about things. And so this is an observation we had from phase 1 that it seemed rushed, and I think people didn't have an opportunity to reflect as much as they would like to. And so this is a way for us to incorporate the thinking that's happening on reflection between meetings, and for us to then take that and incorporate it into and report back on what we heard in the next meeting. So then meeting 3, again, we'd be breaking out, we'd be talking about the kind of policy gaps and where we landed in that discussion, including in what we heard in between meetings. And we'd start to work on recommended policy actions. So again, we'd be anchoring the discussion in both what's come out of the modeling. We will have already talked about the insights in terms of costs and benefits, energy and non-energy of what's coming out of the model. And we'll start to talk about what recommended policy actions we might need to help achieve our goals. And then the homework there will really be, we anticipate, and again, this is all draft. I just want to caveat this is all a draft, and we're really looking for your feedback. But the homework there would be to elaborate on those recommended policy actions and to help inform our drafting of proposed policy recommendations. So we really see this as a kind of step-by-step. Each meeting builds on the other. We'll come with a lot of material to tee up the conversation, but we're not coming from the start with just a straw proposal of recommendations. It's not how we want to run the process. We think it's much more valuable to walk through step by step, starting with the modeling, digging into seeing what insights we can glean, and not just from the model, but from other people's analyses, experiences, and then build on that to identify where we might want to focus our policy recommendations, and then work on coming up with a draft. So checking the time, I think we're still good. So I have a couple of more slides. This is kind of a meaty one. I wanted to make sure to spend a little bit of time talking through it. If we go to the next slide, I'm going to move now to the role of the working groups. So I think it's really important from the start. And again, this is a draft, so also open to your feedback on this, but we think it's really important to define what the working groups are and aren't. And so we see the role of the working groups as substantively engaging on the results of the modeling, on the results of the technical analysis, things like the energy wallet and air quality and geospatial mapping and jobs, and engaging on potential pathways. We also expect the working groups to help us consider the costs and benefits of different pathways and do some of that weighing of implications of different choices that we can make as a state. We also anticipate that the working groups will help us identify barriers and policy gaps and surface near-term policy ideas for consideration. What we do not expect the working groups to be doing is to revisit the modeling inputs for analysis. We'll be presenting the modeling results, and we will be happy to answer questions, clarifying questions, and to dig into what they mean, but we're not going to go back and revisit the model. We're not expecting the working groups to determine a best pathway. We need to set priority direction to define priority actions. That's clear, but that's very different from determining a best pathway or voting on policy recommendations or on which way we need to go. It's not a voting process. It's a conversation. It's a discussion to help inform our thinking and to understand different perspectives, different data, different considerations. We also don't expect the working groups to make final decisions about policy recommendations. We'll present draft policy recommendations to the working groups. We'll then come to you all. We'll have a document that we put out for public comment, and ultimately Odo will be taking on all of that, consulting with our sister agencies and coming up with policy recommendations. And this, and again, the working groups are not the only voice informing the discussion. That kind of noodly slide that I showed earlier with the kind of flow diagram, I think makes the point. So if we go to the next slide, I just want to talk a little bit about how we're working to form these working groups. So we've been evaluating participation in the first phase of the working groups, looking at who participated, what topics they covered, and what we anticipate talking about in these working groups. We're working to identify public partners in the best position to contribute to policy insights within each of the topic areas, each of the working group areas that we've identified. We envision many of the same organizations will participate in the working groups, but the people may be different, as I mentioned. So we're really kind of looking again at the landscape of all the actors in this area in Oregon and just reevaluating. We also seek to include a diverse and balanced range of perspectives, as you see here, and this language comes from the bill, but is also something that we take very seriously to make sure that different interests, perspectives, expertise, education, socioeconomic backgrounds, communities, and geographic areas of the state are represented. And we also need to make sure, as we did in the last phase, that we're ensuring coverage of topics across the energy sector through professional lived experience. And it's a pretty tall order. It's a pretty broad, wide-reaching strategy. And we're also reviewing, we're checking in with state agencies so that we can make sure that we're getting their insights on who they're hearing from, and who we may not be hearing from as much, and we may not think of quite as readily, but who would be really important in the conversation. And finally, if we go to the next slide, I just want to pause for a second and recognize that there are some challenges in this process. And I think we've seen many of these challenges already bubbling up, but I think it's helpful to just be really, really open and also kind of put these on the table for conversation in case anybody wants to add any thoughts. First of all, we're very conscious that we're overlapping in our timeline and in the topics that we're talking about with legislative session. And that's just, it's at the top for a reason. It's a really big challenge. The energy strategy won't come out until November 1st, but obviously session will happen in between, and there'll just be so much overlap with what we're talking about that we need to manage that throughout the process. There's a time constraint. We need to publish this by November 1st. That's why we're putting these timelines out now, and why we've been working really hard to map out how much time we need for the engagement, how much time we need internally to do the drafting and the thinking, and what we need to get ourselves to the finish line by the deadline. We also recognize that it's really important to clearly reflect the feedback that we received. This is something that we talked about back in August. We know that there are conflicting views out there, and those are going to come up. And we recognize that that's going to be really important to get right. And we also know that there's a new federal administration, and that raises uncertainties over priorities and policy focus of the federal government. It's really early days. It's hard to say how that's going to affect our state and how it's going to affect energy sector related areas, but it's also something that's on our minds, and something that will be important to keep in mind as we're working through the energy strategy and seeing kind of how that administration shapes up and starts to roll out its priorities. So that's my last slide, and I realize that it's quite a lot, but hopefully it's helpful in sharing where we've gotten to with our thinking, and really happy to take questions. I see a ton of questions, but I haven't been able to look at that because I've been trying to focus on
questions, comments, reflections, responses. There's a bunch there, but let's start with Jennifer Jolly. You had you had some process questions I think you started with, but why don't you jump in?
I was just going to comment. It sounds like, previously in the working groups, it was anyone who had an interest in a particular topic could participate in a working group, and there was no, I guess, screen on who could participate. So it sounds like for the policy discussion, Odo is going to take a different approach and do appointments and try and achieve some balance that way. Is there any feedback in terms of whether you've achieved that balance? Or I guess I'm just concerned that, I like the previous approach, that it was an open process that interested participants could participate in. And as you you raised, given the legislative session, many of the policy folks are going to be otherwise engaged and may or may not on a given day be able to participate in a discussion. So that's just some feedback.
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer. Those are all really good points. So I'll just say, I'll start by saying that we're not appointing people. We're really working on forming the groups. And so I don't know that the process is really all that different from last time. I think what I was trying to emphasize is that we're rethinking our starting point for who we invite to the working groups and why, rather than just inviting everybody who was there last time. So we'd like to go through the process again, very similar to last time, where we've kind of done our homework. We've been consulting with a bunch of folks on, who we might be missing. We've been talking internally across teams, and we'll start doing some outreach, but we're open to hearing who is interested in participating in a working group. And we don't have a hard cap, for example, on how many people are in the working groups. We just want to make sure that we're thoughtful and that we are getting that balance. But it's, I would just reframe it a little bit and say that it's not, we're not thinking of it as restrictively as maybe it sounded when I was presenting it. I was just trying to really differentiate that, really make the point that we're going through the process again, because we see value to, again, thinking through from scratch, who it makes sense to invite into the group to begin with. And then, as I imagine what happened last time around is likely to come up again, which is that, people express interest in participating in a working group, and that's great. Or people recommend somebody who we might have missed, or a perspective we might have missed, and we're open to that.
Yeah, Jeff, I think your question was related, so I wanted to bring you in because you had asked about recommendations for members, right? You're on mute though, Jeff. I think it's just a mute button. Hopefully on the bottom of your screen. Shoot. We'll throw our hands up, but just question in the chat was around recommending members. So maybe Edith, you can start there, and then Jeff, if there's anything else, just throw it in the chat. So are you listening? Potential folks from this group as well, and can they send you recommendations for folks that would be strong for the work groups?
Yeah, we would love your recommendations on who would be a strong participant in the working groups. I think it's really helpful if you can do a quick explanation of why. I think that's really helpful because we're trying to map out participants who can cover different topics and make sure that they're providing, that we're getting a diversity of view, that we're getting urban, rural, IOU, COU, etc.
Great. And so, yeah, Jeff, and Shannon, thank you. That's a good modeling of a recommendation and maybe one of the roles that representation could help support. So thank you for doing that. And then Jen Bees, you had a couple pieces. It looks like the energy storage question might have been asked, but if there's more that in that place, or if there's more comment around federal policy, which of course we recognize we can only imagine, but don't, at least I don't think any of us can just know the future. But Jen, why don't you jump in?
Well, I don't have anything more to add. I think the response was sufficient. Thank you.
Okay. And then Rebecca, it sounded like you also had a question about timeline. Did you want to ask any specificity there? I know earlier you had a challenge with maybe coming off mute, but yeah, can't come off mute. Do you want to type your question for a timeline, I guess? And then as you're doing that, Rebecca, I'm sorry that's happening. So reflecting, very concerned about, can we go to the timeline slide, seeing TBD in the scenarios and not having an opportunity to see what will be included regarding hydrogen. And so Rebecca, I'll just lift up that there's been now a couple comments. And so Odo T, I'm just going to ask you to kind of hold the weight of what Rebecca is expressing. There's a kind of a lack of clarity around hydrogen and how it's being included into this process. So I don't know if there's a reflection now, but Rebecca, I think you're making a point, right? And so to the extent that we can go from TBD to some level of clarity, sounds like that's an important ask from her perspective.
Yeah, thanks,
Okay.
Rebecca. We hear that, and I'll just say that we're still working this one out. So we've not just started without letting you know where we landed. We're still working at it.
Okay. So Rebecca, I know you can't come off mute, so I'm trying to emphasize and capture the essence and expression of moving to clarity sooner than later, and certainly in relationship to the modeling. So beyond that, somebody say something? Am I just hearing ghosts? Okay. It's quite possible. So just coming back to the question, so I know Edith did a good job of kind of laying out kind of next steps. But I guess I'm curious if there's other clarifying questions. I think folks have identified some potential membership for working groups that may be missing, shared some concerns around unknowns. And certainly some of the potential unknowns around kind of federal policy, the legislative realities, and then things that you may like. Jennifer, Jolly?
I would just make a push. I mean, I appreciate what you're trying to do in achieving balance on these working groups. And I think you did that the first go around too. You know, you tried to identify and make sure folks were represented to bring particular perspectives and achieve balance. But I also like the ability for people to opt in if they weren't selected. And I don't see any harm that would come from having a more inclusive approach. So that's my 2 cents.
Good. Thank you, Jennifer.
Thanks.
Jim Bees?
I definitely understand the logic and rationale in structuring it this way for sure. And I will just say that it just might be really challenging at the kind of advisory group level to not necessarily be in the weeds and then be weighing in at higher level policy recommendations if you can't. I mean, it just, right, not, I'm not going to nerd out on everything, but there might be things I know enough about to be really curious. So I think that'll just be a challenging thing to manage, is how can we provide insightful feedback when we're not necessarily in the weeds and have all that background to kind of help us get to the point of recommendations.
So that might be a time and capacity question plus a resource and visibility into the work of the work group. So maybe a structural question, and we can't answer, guess, Jen, like, you know, can you be in all the spaces all the times, right? And like Edith, maybe you can describe some of the structures or mechanisms to try to account for what Jen's describing, right? Like, so you have the time and capacity and wherewithal to get into all the weeds and then come into this space and provide that.
And super quick clarification, super quick. I'm not saying I think it needs to be done differently. I'm just saying that's going to be really difficult tension to manage. And so I'm just acknowledging that, right? I think it would be a little tough to keep everybody on track when there's probably going to be a lot of weedy questions maybe that come up.
Yeah, no, that's fair. And then, so I don't know, Edith, if like how you reflect on that, or if there's mechanisms or structures. I think before I would say, well, you could watch the working group meeting. Maybe there's summaries that can be shared. So can you talk about maybe some of the structures that would help an advisory group member who is trying to track all these things and then actually give really good insight in this space, you know, amidst all the moving pieces?
Yeah, thanks, Ben, and thanks, Jen, for the observation, because I think it's a very real one and it's a challenge. So I have a few thoughts. One is that if you or anybody else on the advisory group sees that something would be helpful, please let us know, because we can prepare materials ahead of time, for example, that could be helpful to prepare for a meeting, and you know, try to get those out with enough time to reasonably review, for example. I'll say that all of the working groups will be, and anybody can listen into the working group meetings. So that will also carry over from last time. So even if somebody's not in a working group, they can listen in live. watch the recording. Our comment portal is always open, so there are lots of ways to engage. I'll also say that where the advisory group meetings are going to be really interesting that happen when we're in the midst of the working groups. Part of what we'll be aiming to do is to present what we've heard so far and to kind of sum that up and to try to get additional feedback on the kinds of questions that we've been teeing up. And we will be preparing some materials for the working groups to help prepare them for the conversations. So this is more of just a list of ideas and how we're thinking about the process. And there might be some places where what we're doing for the working groups might also help the advisory group. And we also recognize people have really short time, so or time constraints. And so, you know, when I say materials, probably not a 40-page primer, probably like a 2-page summary of, you know, a key finding from the report that is worth digging into because there's been a lot of controversy around it, for example.
Yeah, and then I want to I'll come back to Rebecca. I recognize, Rebecca, you're at a limit. There's some limitations here with technology. Coupled with, we have an opportunity to provide feedback before modeling begins, particularly on clarity for whether there's opportunity to provide feedback once you figure out the hydrogen H2 assumptions. So again, I mean, this is, I think, a theme that Rebecca is trying to raise around the relationship of the interest she's representing and the opportunity to provide feedback. So I don't know, is that a you question, Edith?
Yeah, I'll say that we had a round of feedback and heard a lot, and we're working with what we heard. I think if there was any kind of drastic change, I think that we would have to see how we communicate that and whether there's time for feedback on that. So I'm being a little bit ambiguous because we're in the middle of working through that hydrogen scenario. There are just some moving parts that we still need to work through, and we're working with Jeremy on data as well. So Rebecca, I don't have a clear answer for you except to say that for the other scenarios, we kind of had the engagement process, we got a lot of comments, and the hydrogen scenario is no different in that we're working through all the comments that we've heard. And we're working with Jeremy now to kind of test out what the most productive kind of structure for that scenario would be. So,
I'll just sit with the concern. Rebecca, I guess this is, I'm sorry that this is the reality. Haven't had the opportunity to provide feedback, hasn't been presented. So maybe Odo team, I'll just encourage you all to reach directly out maybe to Rebecca and just make sure that you all could have a conversation because the technology is not letting it happen today. So if there could be some follow-up. Jessica, do you want to jump in?
I just wanted to add that where Rebecca had asked the question of they haven't had the opportunity to provide feedback because we haven't presented it yet. We're still assessing all the initial input that we got on how to build that scenario. And so we're building the scenario based on that initial feedback. And so that's what we're still piecing through yet. We haven't even gotten to a point where we might want to share anything with anybody beyond that.
Okay, thank you. Other comments, questions, reflections? Brian, you had a question, the original compared to currently adopted. So I think it's a
Then
question.
we have that link. I'm just working to get it to send it to Brian. So Brian, keep your eye on the chat and we'll get that to you quickly.
Thank you, Jessica. Laura?
Yeah, in terms of the working group membership, I do remember that it was a little bit confusing the last time around in terms of just who was in and what you had to do to raise your hand to try to be in. And so I'm just wondering, will there be or was there just a simple interest form just to gauge how many groups are interested in being part of those groups, recognizing that you all are working through it, and I take it more on a sort of relationship-based way, but just making sure that net is cast wide to avoid confusion.
Thanks,
Yeah,
Laura. That's a really valuable comment. And sorry, Ben, I just jumped right in. I think that's a really good idea. So we're gonna take that and talk about it internally. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, not seeing any more hands or comments. We'll do a last call for this section, and then we're kind of moving into our closing. And Jen, I don't know if you got your question answered on the federal piece. I think we'll wait, we'll see what happens. Okay. All right, thank you. Okay, well, let's move, next slide.
Thanks. So,
Yeah, jump in, please.
yeah, we haven't talked about who does this slide. I'm happy to talk about it. As I mentioned, November 27th is the deadline for written feedback on that proposal for Energy Wallet, geospatial mapping, air quality modeling. Just a reminder that those are all mechanisms to help us better understand and interpret the results that come out of the kind of core model. So that's where those sit in the kind of analytical framework. In December, we're giving y'all a break. There's no meeting. We bump up against the holidays, and we don't have an action point in December besides continuing to work on forming the working groups and preparing for the kind of late January kickoff of phase 2. And in the meantime, Jeremy is busy running the model. He is currently running the reference scenario for anybody who's interested. That's kind of what's happening right now. On January 16th, we have our next meeting, and we anticipate that meeting would focus on an update on phase 2. We should have dates on the calendar by then and kind of understand who's in the working groups and have just a more solidified agenda. We also will be able to present our reflection of phase 1 comments. So we've hired on somebody on our staff who is these are the waters that he swims in. And so he has been working through all of the comments that we heard through phase 1. We've of course looked at them all, but he's been organizing it all so that we have all of that kind of reflected and organized so that we can put it out for everybody to see before we kick off phase 2. And we'll also have an update on the modeling, I anticipate by mid-January. So that's a preview of what we anticipate we'll be talking about in January, recognizing that it's a couple months away still. So there might be some developments on that front. And in early 2025, as you've seen, and we've talked about today, we plan to kick off those phase 2 policy discussions. I'll just add that for now, we in our calendars have reserved Wednesdays for those working group meetings, anticipating that Wednesdays might be days in the legislative calendar that people are more free and available to participate in the meetings. But we'll have to see how the agenda looks when it comes out, and we will be adjusting dates to Jennifer, to your point, to make sure that we can get that participation in the working group meetings. It would really be a shame if we had a conflict that was avoidable, and we're going to work really hard to not have that happen.
Great, thanks, Ida. So then Laura's question, so team, just note, looks like the January meeting's not necessarily on calendars yet, so let's make sure that we're confirming dates.
It'll get sent out this week, everybody.
Good. Don't schedule over it. It's coming. It'll be there. Keep it on your hold. And then just, as we, to some of your points, Edith, as we're going through it, the balance between inevitably what will come up in our just human lives, the legislative session, your day-to-day work, really pushing folks. We have built in a model to make sure that there are proxies that can come, but relationships matter, right? The people and continuity. of conversation and expertise matters. And so, we're going to ask you all, right, as Odo's, Department of Energy is doing its best job to try to be accountable to what's happening around this process, right? Asking you all to hold accountability to the space. And I know that's a big ask, and it's going to be hard, particularly with multiple pulls on your time and your energy. But I'll just ask that, folks, as we think about going into next year, these are really important conversations that we'll be getting into. And you just said, right, like overlaid with, simultaneous conversations happening at the legislature. And so it's not lost on me that, y'all are going to be pulled in lots of different directions, but I'll just ask ahead of time that you do your best to prioritize this space for those of you who find the capacity for working groups. Again, Oregon Department of Energy folks will do the best job to try to, prevent conflict that's predictable. But I'll just ask, right, that you all find your way into this space as best you can. If we go next slide, I guess I could just say this reminder, right? There's a link, and Josh put this in the chat earlier. Maybe we can repost the portal to the Power App chat. There's a number of things in the slides today from our SETI conversation, the kind of orange questions, any other further feedback on the working groups and structure and processes that we've talked about today, really eliciting some of that written public comment from members here. And then I think the last slide, or anything to add, team, on the public comment input? Good. Okay. Well, the last slide is thank you. And this is a record time, so I'll give you get about a half hour back in your life. I think this ended at noon, but today will end about 11:30. So I really appreciate you all. As Edith said, we're not going to meet in December. Rakesh, jump in. Are you going to ask a question? Oh, I saw you come off mute, so I didn't want to do my grandiose closing if we were going to have a question afterwards. But really appreciate you all. We're not going to meet in December, but I hope you use that time to kind of wrap up your year, spend time with friends, family, loved ones, and we'll see you on the other side of the new year. Edith, any final closing thoughts?
Yeah, Ben, I really appreciate your closing. It's much more eloquent than what I'm going to say, which is, I just want to put in a small reminder and a request for kind of to reinforce the message that Ben had. I think that I really appreciate people who have come today who are not the main advisory group members who are filling in for folks who couldn't make it today. I think it is really important as much as possible for us to have that continuity of the same people in the room. Since some of us may not know the new people who join, and it's not just about organizations, it is about people and relationships. And relatedly, if you are unable to join a meeting and you have somebody you'd like to step in, please send me an email just so that we can make sure that it's smooth on kind of connecting people to the meeting on that side of things. And just so that we have a heads up, we can give Ben a heads up so that we're not surprised by any names that pop up. So Ben, I just left it in like a non-eloquent space. So I'm going to say, now I have to say something like really, I don't know, like holiday oriented. I don't know, but I really appreciate everybody's time, and it's been quite a year, and we've done a lot of work together on the energy strategy, and I really appreciate everybody's kind of candid. Really, I appreciate you all being really honest and asking hard questions, and also keeping the tone constructive so that we can continue having a dialogue, understanding that there are some pretty difficult topics that we're working on and some pretty different views. So I just want to recognize that and thank everybody.
Thanks, Edith. Jessica, were you going to add anything? I saw your hand pop up.
I was going to give Edith a chance to think about a nice holiday message. So I just wanted to flag that considering all these things, we're going to be working on getting calendar invites out for all of the remaining meetings through the rest of 2025 onto your calendars. So that should help with planning going forward. Thanks.
That's great. Yeah, I mean, I think to the extent that folks can get it on there, that's great. We are 11:29. You got 30 minutes back in your life. Go do whatever that is. I actually see some blue in the sky outside my window, which is gonna, give thanks for that. So anyways, much love, everybody. Appreciate you all. We'll see you on the other side of the year into 2025, and really appreciate all the energy and expertise. And with that, we'll send you on your way. Be well.
Have a great Thanksgiving.
Take care.
Thank you.